So let's take a look inside the presentation tier to see how we're going to access those data objects, or at least that data tier that we defined in the previous video. At the class level, there's a couple of objects you're going to need here. Of course, you're going to need an instance of that product data tier. In this case, we're going to call it the product data object, and it's instantiated here as a new instantiation of the data tier. We've also got a binding source, and it's that binding source that is actually manages the handshake between those form fields that display data and of course can handle updates of data back through the data object and ultimately to the underlying project data set and database that sits in the project folder. This binding source itself, we're actually going to use it to perform the updates, to manage the updates, and we're also going to look to it for some specific events. In particular, we want to access the position changed event. So if we're going to declare an object and actually monitor for events from that object, we have to use that with events keyword you might recall from last year's VB2 course. And here's the position changed event for that binding source. And all this does is it updates that label that's on the status bar on the form. So it's a concatenation of string, record, and the binding source's current position. Current position, of course, is 0 base, so we have to add one to it, concatenated with a space of space, and then of course the binding source total count. So every time you navigate using this application, move from one record to the next, this event triggers, this handler handles it and updates that label at the bottom of the form. So looking at the form load event, this is where we're actually going to set the form up with all of the binding necessary to display the data from the underlying data set from the data table in the MMA books database. For use only in this procedure, I've got an instance of the data set based on my project data set, and that project data set is going to be set to the return value on my data object using the getProducts method. So I'm accessing the data set through my instantiated object, and I'm expecting a return of a data set using the getProducts method defined in the data tier. Here's setting up the binding source. We have to set the data source and the data member. So of course we're going to use the products data set, the data member's products, and we're going to sort this on description. The binding source itself, we're actually monitoring events on it to update that label. We're actually going to move to the end of the data set, and then we're going to move again to the first. And what this does is it actually populates the count property, refreshes the count property, and of course then moving back to the first record. When the program first displays the form, it'll indicate record 1 of however many records there are in the data set. So now we'll go ahead and set the binding for the combo box. We set the data source equal to the product's binding source and the display member equal to description. Now we're going to actually bind the appropriate field. So we still bind, even though we're not going to allow any updating at this field at all, we still bind so that when we move from one record to the next using the combo box, the associated fields, related fields, all display appropriately. If you didn't set up this binding based on product code, you could navigate all you want all day long using the combo box, but there'd be no relation, no connection to the other fields. So we add data bindings, .databindings.add, using the text property based on the product's binding source, and in this case we're not going to bind to description, we're going to bind to product code. That gives us that connection to the rest of the records. These other arguments, false is really just for allowing formatting. So allowing formatting on the combo box, there's no updates available, so there isn't going to be any formatting allowed. And because we don't want updates handled through navigation of this control at all, we set the data source update mode to never. The different options for this are on property changed, on validation, and then back up here to never. And never makes sense for this type of application where the combo box is simply there to allow navigation of the data set. And there's my binding of the other controls. So I've got a label that I'm going to add data bindings to, again using the text property. We're going to access this through the product's binding source, and in this case we want the product code to display in that label. And then there's two text boxes, one for product price and one for quantity on hand. We're putting these in text boxes because these are the two fields that we expect the user may edit. And of course, all of this in the form load is all enclosed in a try-catch statement. We're not sure what we're going to catch. More often than not, this would be during development, although in a distributed database environment, there are many connectivity issues that may occur. So we enclose this in a try-catch, just catching the default exception. For development purposes, we're going to go ahead and pass the load exception message through and maybe even the stack trace to try to help us debug. But once we put this thing into production, we don't actually want to send the exceptions message or stack trace through, because that would reveal data object names, potentially field names, table names and field names. So I've got another message box here. I've got it commented out right now, but I've got it ready to go for once this thing goes into development, and I will comment out this. And because this is load and the form was unable to load properly showing all the data, this is pretty much a critical error, so we go ahead and we close the application. So the only other event handler I want to take a look at is an event handler for a button update click event. And this isn't necessarily the only way to handle updates, but this is one way. And there's very little to this. This could be a spot where you might want to perform data validation. So understanding that its price and on-hand quantity are the only two fields that might be edited, we would probably add data validation to this event. And in fact, we would validate to the point where as long as price was a valid price, so check it for decimal, you could even check it using some of the string methods to ensure that it actually looks like it's money. And then product on hand should be an integer. Once it passes both of those validations, then you can go ahead and try to update the underlying data set using the data object that we've instantiated. First thing you need to do to complete any update is ensure that you're putting an end to any current edits from the session. So this is a pretty tight application in terms of the way updates are handled, but it's always good form to include that end edit on a binding source prior to issuing an update, just in case there's anything floating around that may prevent the update from occurring because you've got an open edit currently underway. So we just invoke the end edit on our binding source, and then we go ahead and submit changes through our data object by calling on the update method of the data tier. The next thing we want to do, of course, is update our status label. So we just go ahead, this isn't going to be a record number such and such of so many records, this is just the record was updated successfully. So of course we want to catch any exceptions, and we're just looking for a general exception, and for development we'll just go ahead and pass that exception message through to the developer to help in debugging this possible problem. And then once we put it into production, we'll go ahead and just put a generic sort of harmless message out that doesn't reveal any of the underlying data objects, table or field names. So there's a very simple data tier, presentation tier example, and this along with the templates provided with the lab should help get you through Lab 3.